Guests is something that everybody should at least consider. You don't have to do it for every single episode.
And I'm not sure you can create that impact with as little time involvement with any other marketing method.
So how have you been able to help people get guests?
Hey, so we're back for this episode. And what are we talking about this week?
Guests
on podcasts, utilizing guests on your own podcasts. Yeah, we'll talk about the benefits of having guests within your podcast, how to get guests, or the approaches that we often utilize to get guests, and try and alleviate some of your fears about contacting guests or potential guests to be on your show. So where do you want to start, Tolu?
I think let's start with why have guests, because I think that that's one of the big decisions people make when they're starting their podcast is, do I do solo episodes? Do I have guests? How do I run it? Guests is something that everybody should at least consider. You don't have to do it for every single episode, but I think it adds a nice bit of variety into what you're doing. I think that it builds some really, really good relationships with, whether it's potential customers or potential collaborations. I think it builds out your relationships and also exposes you to new audiences. So especially if you get some guests that are, reasonably well known, they've got good audiences behind them, I think it can also expose you to different audiences that you might not have had access to before. Yeah,
and fresh perspectives within the industry, whatever you're trying to do, rather than just being your voice, you're bringing other voices on board for your audience to listen to. I've actually got a great case study for what you just mentioned. I don't think I mentioned it to you before. You talked about building relationships as part of the podcast and using it almost like a sales tool. We had a company in here, she couldn't get past the gatekeeper at all. So she thought outside of the box and said, well, what if I invite the leader of that company, the direct contact she was trying to get in touch with, onto my podcast? She'd already done 6 or 7 shows as well. Get him onto the show and just see if I can build that relationship. Yeah. So she reached out through LinkedIn, through emails, through phone calls. In the end, he said, yeah, I'm happy to help. I'll come on your show. So she basically had 45 minutes to an hour direct access to the one contact in the industry she was trying to sell to, past the gatekeeper. So she literally just went round. She built that relationship, and we were recording over there in the studio, and I was just mesmerised because by the end of the show, they'd had another little 5-minute discussion. She had also explained what her product and service is, software as a service, and they'd almost bought into it by then. So she'd used the podcast as a sales tool to reach out to a business leader, still got a show out of it, a very interesting, engaging show, but also sold to an industry leader as well within that.
This is a really interesting way of looking at podcasts. Is one side is like the views and that kind of stuff that comes from it, but the other side is the relationships. And if you use guests in the right way, you will have some amazing relationships. And I've seen it with so many people who I've helped to start podcasts. At times they start to get into like, am I getting views and this and that? But then I'm like, okay, how many episodes have you done with a guest? And they're like, well, 30. And I'm like, and how are those relationships with those guests? And they're like, it's amazing. Actually, this one's referring me into this one. And I'm like, that's the gold in it, is the relationships that you build with people that you probably want to work with anyway.
Absolutely. And I think we touched on this, well, definitely touched on this on episode 1, is the sanity metrics over vanity metrics. And this whole Podfather series is about helping companies to utilize podcasts, not necessarily individuals. So for me, using it as a tool to build relationships with an ideal network for your business, that's invaluable. I don't care if I get 1 million views and the views are from people who are never going to buy our service, 16-year-olds, 85-year-olds in different countries. It's of no relevance to me. Whereas having 300, 400 views within a local area who want to use a studio or marketing, and we've got other podcasts that run beauty salons, well, if you've got 300 people watching your podcast, genuinely interested, and you've got high duration of views as opposed to people watching for 20 seconds, that to me is a far better metric, because these are people who are going, I want to probably use that salon. They're looking for differentiators in different beauty salons or different services. Well, this is one differentiator because you've built that personality and you've showcased that personality to your ideal audience. So
I love that you reminded us of the vanity versus sanity, because even on LinkedIn, I spend quite a lot of time on there, and people are talking about how, well, my impressions are going down, but they're getting shown to better people, and actually now I'm getting more inquiries and different things like that. So if you can get it right in your podcast, that you've got good call to actions, you're sending people to the right places, even if you're not getting hundreds of views, like you might be getting views from the exact people that you want to buy. So I think that is so important. What are the call to actions that you want off the back of your episodes, and what do you want people to be doing after being a guest or after listening to your podcast? What's your flow after that?
Yeah, because I don't think the ultimate goal of a company starting a podcast is for them to feel like they're now podcasters.
No.
They're using it as a sales tool to open opportunities.
100%.
And that's how I see it. It's just open opportunities, tap into new audiences, build those relationships. And obviously having guests on board is a great way of tapping into their audience as well, because you're not just relying on people who follow us. If we get a guest on here, we're tapping into their audience, because their audience are going to watch what they have to say as well. So that's a good way of building out your view count, your follower counts. So getting that vanity metric up, but also opening those doors as well for audiences that maybe you could never have tapped into.
Because I think it gives you that credibility. So having someone who other people esteem highly and them sitting down with you and having a conversation, that also gives you that boost of credibility. It gives people that reason to actually say, okay, I'm going to stop scrolling and listen to Deren because I see him with someone I know. You know, it gives that really good opportunity for credibility.
Yeah, it's like when you watch Stephen Bartlett, his reels are always popping up, and anyone who's sat with him, you're like, I just wonder what their backstory is to be on the Stephen Bartlett, on Diary of a CEO. So like I say, it's just instant credibility. And if you're trying to use this to become an industry voice and have that credibility in the industry, to work with people within that industry as well. So you're building that community with your podcast.
Oh, that's a really great point, actually, is the community element of it. And if you do this really well, your podcast guest alumni could become its own little community. And I've seen some people do that really, really well, where they've had, 20, 30 guests on, and now they're connecting those people as guest alumni or podcast alumni and having a little mini network within that as well. And that's really powerful too.
Yeah, and of course, all these people are going to be connected in some way, because if it's an industry podcast, you've got industry leaders in or whoever, they're all going to know each other. It's just a nice way of them networking as well. And the common denominator being you hosting all of them in the first place. And again, just being that voice for the industry, but having that fresh perspective coming in. Because otherwise, if it's just your perspective, obviously with Podfathers, it's us trying to give value in terms of how we approach it. But later on, we probably will have guests. We'll talk to other podcasters that we've had in the studio that you've helped build as well, to get their perspectives on the whole podcasting journey and how it's impacted them. And that will hopefully bring their audiences into us as well. So for me, it's a huge, huge benefit for the amount of time involved in actually creating a podcast show, the impact that can have. And I'm not sure you can create that impact with as little time involvement with any other marketing method.
And also, even when you think of the cost, right? So when you think of like cost per thousands and things like that, podcasting is very, very reasonable in terms of the audiences it can get you in front of for not very much money. So I think it's also something to think about. And then the repurposing of the content, all those things that you can do with it, I think it just makes it so cost effective for a business to do.
Yeah, and of course we talked about AI last time in terms of repurposing content. You've used that one channel with that one guest, but repurposed it in so many different ways in terms of blog posts, newsletters, sales spiels, little reels, etc. You've got tons and tons of content to work with, and each episode you've got a different guest bringing in different perspectives as well. So I think for me that basically covers the benefits. I think if you don't understand the benefits of having a guest on the show, we can try and clarify, but I'm not sure there's any more we can say it's important to have guests, but it's not essential when you first start. So what I don't want is for people to think this is a stopping block for them to think, well, until I get a guest, I'm not going to start a podcast.
No.
I think for me, you need to almost refine your skills and have a co-host or have someone within your business. Let's say you're the director, get your marketing manager involved and talk about industry insights and news. And then as you have 3-4 episodes, you've refined your interview skills, invite guests on at that point.
And to be fair, we say this pretty much almost every episode, is that like the important thing is for you to start moving towards it and to get going. And even if it's just you pick a news article and you talk about it, like that's actually okay. That's a good way to start, good way to practice. I love what you said about bringing in someone else from the company. You guys already have some kind of rapport together. You hopefully like each other, so you can just have those conversations and just practice, like you said.
Yeah, and it's never going to be terrible. It's your opinions. And if you don't want to air it, fine, use it as a practice. But rather than going, right, episode 1, we need the biggest guest we can get on board, it's very difficult to do that because guests also want to know that you have a back catalogue. They want to see what you've actually done, what it's going to look like. They don't want to put their credibility on the line for something they're not sure about. So if you've done a few episodes, you've aired them, you've put them on social media, they know what they're buying into. And it's a lot easier to then get them on board, which obviously is one of our topics is
how do you...
That probably leads on to it. It's almost like we planned it. You carry on. I don't want to keep us double talking.
It's about how do we get guests now. So this is one of the things that you guys do. So how have you been able to help people get guests?
I think fundamentally, the first thing I want people to understand is getting guests is not that difficult. If you're talking about A-list celebs, it becomes trickier, it becomes costlier. That's one thing. But just reaching out to people within your industry, and saying, hey, we've got a podcast, we talk about this, here's episode 1 and 2, you can watch it, we'd love for you to be on it, and almost boost their ego of saying, we've been following you, you'd be a great insight on our podcast as well to our audiences, would you mind coming to help us? And would you want to dedicate 45 minutes of your time either in a studio environment or online if it's less of a barrier to entry as well? And for us, just emailing, sending DMs, emailing agents of stars or celebs and saying, look, this is what we do, would you want to be involved? And you'd be surprised the amount of yeses we get. And again, if you get 100 no's but you get 15 yeses, that's 15 episodes sorted. And that's not to say just target everybody. You still need to research, and it still needs to be right for your podcast. They need to bring in the right perspectives to get that message across. But we've sent DMs, we've sent emails. I know what you're going to say with your approach, and I do love this. What's your approach?
So my approach is split into a couple of things. So one of them is referrals. So when I was starting my podcast, I put a big post on LinkedIn that basically said, hey, starting a podcast, looking for this type of person. So mine was really, really good leaders. And then I got referrals. And if, someone's messaged me and say, hey, I think Bob's a good leader. When I message Bob and I say, hey, Deren said you're a great leader, would you be up for being on the podcast? The ego thing, I really liked it because we're all humans. We all have egos. Everybody needs their ego straight a little bit. That thing of, well, so-and-so thinks that you'll be good for this type of podcast is always going to be really helpful. It comes with a bit more credibility. Then the other thing that I do as well is that if I see some people who I might want to have on my podcast, I will engage with their content. So LinkedIn is my main platform. I will engage with them on LinkedIn in their comments, because one of the things that's really hard is putting out content, because often the engagement doesn't come. So just by giving someone some engagement on their post, you already become more familiar to them. You already become, you might even have conversations in the comments with them and things like that. And I found that that's been really, really powerful in terms of building good relationships with people that may then later even ask me to be on my podcast, because now they've started to see who I am, what I'm about, and we've had those conversations in the comments.
And you've built that rapport through the comments. But how long do you normally wait before you go, hey, we've commented, do you want to be on my podcast? Do you wait? Is there a certain period of time you wait?
That's a really good question. I think it depends. So some of the really, really popular people, I might wait a few months and just build that rapport. And just if there's so there was one guy who he'd actually made a mistake. So he'd made a post twice. So I actually messaged him privately and said, hey, you made a mistake. I don't know if this is a mistake or not, but this came up twice. He was like, thank you so much, blah, blah, blah. And I left it. And then a few months later, I was like, oh, hey, would you be up for being on the podcast? He then replied later. He could see the comments we've had before, the conversation. So it really just depends on probably the size of their following and stuff like that.
And how inundated they get as well with their messages.
Exactly.
Fine,
exactly. So some of those kind of bigger people you build a bit more of a rapport with, but for some other people, and some people just seem up for it. You might see that they were on another podcast and be like, okay, hey, would you want to be on mine if this is what you're doing? So it just really depends, I think. I don't think there's a set time.
I love the fact that obviously it is just another way of being proactive and opening opportunities without costing a penny. And all you're doing is commenting, building rapport. You're not trying to sell anything. And when it comes time to go, hey, Bob, would love you on your podcast, all you can say is, no, thanks, I'm busy. All right, cool.
And if he says no, I keep commenting on his post. I don't then say, well, because you
unfriend.
said... No. Nothing like that. Or even if you don't reply to me, anything like that, I'm not commenting just to get you on my podcast. I'm commenting because I enjoy your content. So whether you say yes, you say no, I'm still going to keep doing it.
I'm still here pestering you. Yeah, and I think that's the right approach, because you shouldn't treat it as a complete sales tactic. No. Like I say, you should do it because you genuinely want to build those connections, those networks, and you never know what's going to come of it. And when it is the right time to go, would you love to be on my podcast? Chances are they're going to turn around and say yes. If they're not a million miles away, and if they are, you jump on Riverside and have the call then.
Something like a bit of a LinkedIn tip that people might not know. So I have lots of people come up to me and go, you are literally everywhere on my LinkedIn feed. And it's not because I post every day, because I don't. It's just because I comment and I like stuff. And actually that brings you to top of mind, because LinkedIn goes, oh, Tolu commented on this, and it shows the comment, shows the post, and it gives you so much more coverage. And so I've not put out content on LinkedIn for maybe 6 months now.
But because you've liked and commented, it shows up on the feed. It's like, oh God, Tolu likes everything.
Exactly.
God, he comments on everybody's stuff.
Exactly.
And it's just an easy way to create content and be staying relevant and being in people's faces without any effort, without any cost. And if you can tie a podcast within that, where you're also posting out reels and they can see what you're doing, they know what they're commenting back to as well.
Exactly.
Because, even if we get 200 people looking at our stories, I guarantee one of us up there is scrolling through going, oh, who are these people?
Yeah.
It's just out of interest and out of intrigue. And I think that even if they've got 5,000 people, people are still reading these comments in their spare time.
I think that the world we live in now, right, when you say, I only got 300 views, imagine if 300 people were in front of you watching your stuff. That's a lot of people, but now we have people with millions of followers and hundreds of millions. It feels like...
And that's what you're benchmarking against now.
But that's not...
Well, I've only got 300 people watching me.
That's crazy. Could you perform that in front of 300 people right now? Like, probably not. So we need to put some of these things into perspective, because even if 1% of those people buy, you've still sold 3 things. We need to put those numbers into a really good perspective when we're looking at how we're doing with these things.
Yeah, and also understand why you're doing this in the first place. Every business now needs to create content. It's very difficult to keep coming up with fresh content. Doing a podcast for an hour, we've said it before, you can cut 20, 30 reels off. That's every day you can post a reel, pick out profound bits, entertaining bits, etc. And on top of that, commenting on LinkedIn, liking on LinkedIn, building relationships, doing the same thing on Instagram, doing the same thing on Facebook. It's just a great way of just people understanding who you are and you staying relevant.
Yeah. Because even now, LinkedIn aggregates everybody's comments. So it will show all the comments you've made in one place. And it's really important that you remember that. So it's not like, don't go trolling people and thinking that's going to help. Like, make value-added comments and ask questions and be actually genuinely interested. It's not just great post.
Copy-paste 10,000 times.
Yeah, don't use AI for that one.
I think people just have to be less afraid of approaching others and saying, look, we've got a podcast. It's within your industry. We think you'd be great on this podcast. You live 10 miles down the road. Do you want to just come to the studio, or do you want to jump on Riverside and let's just chat? And if you send out 100 of those to genuine people you'd want on your podcast, I would bet that you would get a minimum of 5 people saying, yeah, sure, tell me time, date. Or sometimes if they're superstars, you kind of have to be a bit more flexible to their schedule. They're busy people. So if they say I can do Thursday evening at 10 p.m, you might have to do Thursday at 10 p.m. You just make it work. So what's your approach once you've landed a guest then? Because I think we've covered how to approach and don't be scared of actually approaching people. But what's the approach at that point? So
I personally have like an FAQs email that I send through. So I send a bit of an email that says, hey, these are some of the things that we might be talking about. Depending on like if it's to the studio, I might say, okay, this is how you get there. Or if it's going to be Riverside, I'll say, here's the instructions. Here's some of the things to consider for your setup. So I give them a bit of a pre-briefing. And then I give people the option of, do you want to do like a pre-chat? Where we can actually like spend half an hour, I get to know you, you get to know me, we plan out the episode a little bit, or do you want to just kind of go straight in for a slightly longer recording where we do that at the beginning and then we record? I would say 60 to 70% of people go for the pre-session. So they want to invest the time to get the message right. Yeah. I know not everyone's going to be the same, but for me, it's all about the planning. It's about the research. And I think we love having those pre-production calls to those guests and saying, look, what message do you want to get across that promotes you in the best possible light? What sort of leading questions do you want us to ask you to ensure you get your business, your passion, your expertise across? And we can list everything out. We've got prompt cards with some notes on. That doesn't take a huge amount of time. And also it helps you build that relationship prior to just jumping onto the sofa or jumping onto Riverside for the first time. In my opinion, we don't do a lot of Riverside. I know you love that's your speciality. For us, it's all studio based. So if you imagine, and I've got an example of this, I'll tell you in a second. A guest has just turned up. They've never been into studio. They've come to meet their host for a podcast show. It's the first time they've really met or spoken, apart from a few comments or emails. That's quite daunting to a lot of people. Even if they're a business leader, it's still quite daunting. Whereas if you take that away by having a 20-minute discussion first on Zoom 3-4 days before, and them to understand that you want to get the best across for them during that episode, they already turned up relaxed. They've already feel like they know you. They know that you've got their best interests at heart before you even sit down on the sofa. And I think already they're more relaxed, more comfortable, and there's a lot more engaging content that's going to come out of that, hopefully, because they feel comfortable. And I think it's slightly different to Riverside because you're not having that studio environment where it can be a bit daunting. I think, though, what you said about them knowing that you have their best interest at heart, I think that's so important.
Regardless, yeah.
So, like, whatever platform you're on, that's part of what I say in those conversations. Like, look, I'm not here to trip you up. I'm not going to be like a journalist trying to...
Piers Morgan to rip you apart.
No, this isn't that kind of thing. Like, I want people to know how great you are. So this is what we're trying to get to. And I think that's such an important point you made about making people feel comfortable with that and having a bit of a plan about, okay, this is how we're going to get to that. I think that bit is so important. Yeah,
and if you can get that across in your FAQ sheets or your emails, fantastic. But I think for me, I'm more of a personable person. I love phone calls. I love Zoom. I encourage it. So I think just to get onto a Zoom call with an upcoming guest from one of the shows saying, can't wait to have you. Car parking's great. We've got toilet facilities. We've got this. We've got that. Don't worry about anything. There's a few roadworks. Already they think like when they turn up they're like matey and pally.
Yeah.
And I love that aspect of it because I already feel relaxed.
And I think even if you think about it from a business perspective, the more touch points you have, the better it's going to be. So have the pre-call, have the session there, do a debrief after. The more touch points that you can actually have with that person, the better the relationship's going to be. And
share the podcast before you make it go live. Going, is there anything you'd want us removing out of that you think might be detrimental to your business or to your personal brand? And again, they're feeling like, okay, you're not using this for clickbait. No. You have got my best interest at heart and you're showing that to me. And that's where more referrals are going to come in.
Yeah.
Where they're going to go, well, actually, Jim and Sally and Gary, get them on your show. I'll put in a good word for you. And all of a sudden, you're not reaching out to loads and loads of guests hoping for the best. These guests that have been on, they've had that experience with you, are quite happy to recommend others because they've enjoyed that experience.
I think that's such an important thing that people need to remember to do is ask for referrals. Like, ask them, who else do you know that would be good for this? And there's a really important bit about it's not do you know anybody else, it's who else do you know? Because if you ask people, do you know anyone else?
It's a closed question. Yes or no.
But who do you know is like, now I'm thinking of actual people. And one of the things that we do sometimes as well is that when we post a guest episode, we look at who likes it, who likes the post and things like that. And if they like the post, then maybe they might be a good option for a guest. So we ask the guest, okay, these are some of the people that like the post. Who do you think would be good for an episode?
And I suppose you would do your own little research on them as well by clicking on their profiles and going, actually, you'd be great. Reach out. We've had Bob on the show. I think you'd be great too.
Exactly.
And again, it's just that proactive approach and treating this like a business as well, as opposed to just assuming that everyone's going to watch your podcast and go, I'd love to be on your podcast. It doesn't, especially when you first start out, it does not work. You have to put in the time and the effort.
Yeah.
What else would you then do with the guests in terms of pre-production?
I generally like to keep it a bit lighter touch so that there's not too much, but some touch points in between. So like maybe you message them or day before. So I know that some places when you're coming there the day before you'll get an email. And I think that's one of the things that you guys do as well, that you've got some emails that come out before and just to keep those touch points going and make sure people are still okay for it.
Just little reminders and nudges. Because last thing you want is having your show ready and the guest goes, so sorry, I thought it was tomorrow.
Exactly.
I mean, sending out automated emails on Calendly or using any type of software is pretty much free now.
Yeah.
Just set the templates up 2 days before you get an email.
Yeah.
And if at that point you have an issue with it, you can contact them. You can replace your guest with someone else or come up with a different plan. But the last thing you want is sitting either in a studio or on Riverside going, oh, they've forgotten because I didn't remind them.
Yeah.
Because these are, again, busy. Everyone's busy. Even if you're not a business leader, you are still busy in life in general. So you just need those little touch points.
I send calendar invites. Like, my life is dictated by my calendar.
Oh, yes.
If it's not in my calendar, it almost doesn't exist. And
agreed.
A lot of business leaders are exactly the same. So it's good to have that agreement, but make sure, even if it's in a studio or not like in person, you send over a calendar invite, and maybe you send it over with a bit of buffer time for travel as well. So start to think of some of those things just to make it really easy for them. Put all the details in the calendar invite so they know exactly what's going to happen.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, we try and do that. And even things like we've had roadworks near the studio recently. We updated all the templates to say, please add another 15, 20 minutes to your journey because there's roadworks here, which leads you into more roadworks. It was horrendous here for a couple of months. But even that, they're reading that and they're not panicking. They just leave half an hour earlier because we've told them to. Because otherwise, how else would they know? Until they get in their car and go, oh, Google have added another half an hour. Sorry, I'm going to be late. The problem with that is it then has a knock-on effect. They start panicking and it's just not an enjoyable experience. Whereas just a little touch point to go, add another half an hour to your journey, they know the night before.
I think a lot of this is just making things as easy as possible for your guests and making them feel as comfortable as possible.
But that's how it should be in general for business anyway, not just podcasting.
Yeah.
Again, it's just part of building relationships, is you want to be known as the company or the person that makes it easy for other people to work with them, almost handing it to them on a silver platter. That surely gives enough perspective to our audience to go, I just need to send some emails out. I need to get on LinkedIn. That is the main advice, because otherwise you can talk for hours about the hosting techniques and everything else, which we'll have a different episode for anyway. Don't not podcast because you can't get a guest. You can always find someone within your team, within your business, a friend if it's a personal brand that you're trying to build. Just start planning for that. Do, especially when you've just started out, do 2-3 episodes, get comfortable with the entire journey of that, and then start inviting guests on, even if they don't come on till episode 10, but still have that frequency coming out, and just reach out to people. Again, people want to help. They like their ego being boosted as well. You know, if they're industry leaders, tell them you've been following them, you love their stuff, and they could bring a fresh insight into your audience as well.
Something that I would just add is the volume is really important. So like I said, if you reach out to 100 people, you might get 5, 10, whatever responses. But if you only reached out to 10 people, you might get 0 responses. So you have to put in the volume as well to do it. And the more volume you do, the better you get at it. Because then you start to realize, this didn't quite work. Oh, okay, people really responded to this thing. So test it out with some volume and see, okay, I've sent out 100. What's coming back? You know, how is it working?
But that's core marketing. That's split testing.
Yeah.
Test your approach at different times. If you're going to go on LinkedIn, send a message, send one at 8 p.m, send one at 6 a.m. See what people are responding to. And yes, it is a numbers game. Also, people are busy. It gets lost within their spam box or whatever else. So you have to just nudge them again 3-4 weeks later. But
don't be afraid to follow up.
I think that's crucial. You can't just put something out there and go, well, if they don't come back, they're not interested. Well, no, they could have just lost it because they had 15 emails coming at the same time at that particular moment.
Do you remember I sent you an email and then I sent you a follow-up email and you're like, oh, weird, I didn't get this first one, but I got this second one. You know, and that wasn't even because you ignored me or anything like that. It was just something happened with the email. That's right. And that was actually an email I was expecting from you, which I didn't get. And I was sitting there thinking, oh, maybe he's lost interest. And he's sitting there going, maybe he doesn't want to help me. But you're right. You just sent a follow-up going, oh, did you get that email? No, I didn't. Can you send it again? Yeah. Oh, yeah, sure. I'll answer that right away. Exactly. And you can imagine, you're talking with other businesses, they are busy. They get emails all the time. So even if you email them every 3-4 weeks, they're not going to see that as hassling them until they come back and say, not interested, please leave me alone. Please stop commenting on every single one of my posts. You then have permission to keep nudging them. Yeah. Agreed. That's how I would approach that. And it works for the podcast that we run here and we distribute and we market. That's how we get guests for people. So if it works for us, why would it not work for every other podcast? Let's wrap it up for this episode, I think, and then we can come back with another episode. Sounds good. About another topic. Yeah. Thanks, guys, for listening. Fantastic. Thanks for listening. Subscribe, follow. We're going to have resource sheets on the website, links as well, where you can download some more information. We'll repurpose this into blog posts so you can read it if you don't want to watch us and listen to us. So cool. We'll see you next time. See you next time.